Hi, guys. Hope you're all doing well. Okay, I'm going to start today. We're going to move into the second half of the 19th century. If you haven't guessed, this unit's called the modern world, but really I could have just called it the 19th century for all intents and purposes. But I think particularly as we get into the second half of the 19th century, you're really going to start recognizing the world of today. And I don't just mean in geopolitical terms, but I also mean the way they live their life, the way they think about the world is a lot more in tune with the way we think about the world than we have had any time previously. So what's going on in the second half of the 19th century that we would consider to be kind of the turning point and make it the modern world? Well, first off, we now have a concern for mass society. And mass society is a society that caters to the needs of the majority of the population, the lower classes particularly. So during this time, about 80% of Europeans were considered members of the lower class, which included agricultural workers, urban laborers in factories, and skilled artisans. And when a society pays attention to the masses, their living standards tend to go up in total. And when living standards increase, it leads to the ability of having a lot more free time to engage in what is known as mass leisure. And mass leisure is simply any leisure activity that appeals to the majority of the people in a society. So modern examples of this would be going to the beach or to the movies. For the most part, the changes spurred on by the Second Industrial Revolution led to the emergence of mass society. And with extra money to spend, department stores popped up in cities. And at this point in history, malls didn't exist and shopping was restricted to needed items such as cooking utensils. The department store, however, ushered in a whole new age of consumerism. And these huge stores offered clothes for men, women, and children, furniture, and much more. In other words, you didn't have to go to 3rd Street and go to a clothing store and then hustle all the way over to 6th Street to look at furniture. It was all in one giant place that you could go look at these things, be exposed to the newest, the latest, the greatest, and create some consumerism. Now, in the 1880s and 1890s, new work opportunities, shorter work hours, a rise in wages, and a decline in the cost of products allowed a lot of people to look to recreational activities during their time off. So what kind of activities did people enjoy? Well, it turns out a lot of the same ones we actually enjoy today. So during this time, music and dance halls were very popular. And although they were very different than the clubs of today, the basic idea of young people socializing through music and dancing was there. Another popular form of entertainment was watching team sports such as baseball, football, rugby. And while sports were not new, they began to be more organized during this time with rules and regulations, and transportation allowed teams from different parts of the countries to come together and play each other. I'm a big college football history aficionado, and what you see in the middle of the 19th century in America is the beginning of some of the great college football teams that are out there. So team sports eventually became the professional organizations we recognize today, and players were adored like movie stars. Think Babe Ruth during this time. And again, gender differences kept women out of sports considered too physical. They were usually only permitted to participate in sports such as croquet, or actually basketball. The high school I student taught in had their halls lined with old sports pictures, and this is an old town high school, and they had pictures from the 1890s of the girls basketball team. And what's funny is they're all wearing ankle-length dresses. That's their athletic uniform to play basketball in. So there were instances of women breaking this barrier by playing in organizations such as the Women's Football Club. That's soccer to you and I. But people frequented amusement parks. They went on vacations to beach destinations, all the things that we would kind of think of as modern and things we do today. Beginning in 1850, the health of many Europeans began to improve greatly. Urban reformers spotlighted many societal ills such as unsanitary cities and unregulated food. And public awareness of these problems led to many changes that increased the population of Europe. For instance, in the years between 1850 and 1910, the European population rose from 270 million to 460 million within that 60-year time period. And one of the main reasons for this dramatic change was new vaccinations. At the end of the 19th century, vaccines for typhoid fever, the bubonic plague, Rabies, cholera, tetanus were all introduced. And these have been major killers in times past. So by the early decades of the 20th century, vaccines for yellow and scarlet fever, tuberculosis, and others were made as well. And these advancements in medicine saved the lives of countless people and caused a substantial decline in mortality rates. Now, along with mass society came mass education, or the availability of education to a majority of the population. Previous to this time, for the most part, education was something that only the wealthy could afford for their children, and they would hire private tutors to do it. So it may surprise some to know that in the beginning of the 19th century, most states did not provide or even require education for children. In fact, education was still a privilege of the wealthy, and this all began to change in the 1870s when a lot of states took control of education. Countries established education for both boys and girls between the ages of 6 and 13 for the most part. So within the next few decades, many European countries had established free public education and teacher training. So why this new commitment to education? Well, historians believe it was a combination of things like a genuine belief in the value of knowledge, a need for skilled workers to run the factory machines, and the need in a democracy to have educated voters. However, education was still not equal. During the early years of public education, different subjects were taught to boys than were taught to girls. For instance, typically girls had little instruction in math and science and focused mostly on learning domestic skills such as sewing and cooking. However, the demand for teachers did create opportunities for women. I myself am a fourth-generation teacher. My mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother were all teachers before me. And you'll notice that's kind of how women were able to get into the workforce in early 20th century America, was through the teaching profession. So in fact, since teaching was considered a form of nurturing, it was considered an acceptable extension of women's roles as caregivers of the household. Some of the first college opportunities for young women occurred at schools set up to train teachers. Matter of fact, those schools were called normal universities. In Illinois, we have a whole town named after Illinois State Normal University, which was a university that taught teachers. It's now just called Illinois State University, ISU, but it is still in the town of Normal. So another social advancement occurred in the fight for women's suffrage, or women's right to vote. The movement for women's suffrage really became a political issue in the 1840s and 1850s in Europe. In Britain, women's movements were in agreement about the importance of gaining this right, but they were divided over how best to accomplish these goals. The two prominent groups that emerged were the liberals under the leadership of Millicent Fawcett and the radical group led by Emmeline Pankhurst. Now, if you remember our lectures last week about the isms, what you get is the liberals are more what we would call conservatives of today. We're talking about classical liberalism. The radicals are much more what we would call progressives or liberals today. So while Fawcett advocated peaceful tactics such as demonstrations, Pankhurst's group engaged in more militant work such as chaining themselves to lampposts, vandalizing stores, throwing eggs at members of the government, and they were frequently arrested. A small number of states, and when I say states, I'm not talking about the United States, I'm talking about nation states. So a small number of countries basically granted women the right to vote before 1914. However, many had to wait until the end of World War I when women's contributions cemented their place as citizens. The second industrial revolution that I've kind of already alluded to was another great leap forward in technology and society. And new innovations in steel production, petroleum, electricity led to the introduction of public automobiles and airplanes. So the first industrial revolution was kind of the factory and mass production of basic goods. But the second industrial revolution was automation for the most part. It was getting rid of natural power, whether that be human, animal, wind, water. Now we're using things like electricity. We're burning petroleum oil, and we're creating the ability to run machinery that will do these things much better. So historians have labeled the years from 1870 to 1914 as the period of the second industrial revolution. And while the first industrial revolution caused the growth of industries such as coal, iron, railroad, textiles, the second industrial revolution witnessed the expansion of electricity, petroleum, and steel. And many of the changes that occurred during this period had to do with new products simply replacing old ones. For instance, during this time, steel began to replace iron. It was cheaper to make, you didn't need as much iron, and it was actually stronger. So steel was being utilized for construction projects industrial machines, railroads, ships, a lot of other items. And steel production made it possible for railway lines to be built at competitive costs, which further spread transportation. So now, making a railroad was pretty expensive. So only did it in limited, like major urban areas or to connect factories. But now that it was cheaply made with steel, we could make the railroad, for example, that went the intercontinental, that went all the way across America to California. And it's hard to imagine a time when electricity was not a common luxury. However, the beginning of the second industrial revolution was just such a time. Before the introduction of public electricity, candles and gas lamps were used to light homes and factories and streets. And a lot of activities were just simply done in the daytime, and night ceased most activity. The use of electricity fundamentally changed the way people worked and lived. And the first efficient commercial electrical generator was used in the 1870s. And when I say electricity, we have a tendency to think of lighting, but there are so many other aspects of electricity, such as machinery. In 1881, Great Britain was the very first country to install a public power station. And beginning in 1910, it was possible to power a residential area from one single station, so that home lighting became more prolific. So the introduction of public electricity led to a lot of inventions, as you can imagine. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Thomas Edison and Joseph Swan finally perfected the design of the light bulb in 1879. Contrary to popular myth, Edison did not invent the light bulb. In fact, less efficient light bulbs had been around for decades earlier. So why is Edison given credit for this invention? Well, his design was the first one that was practical for home use. Edison's light bulb was economical and safe. These other previous light bulbs cost a fortune to buy, and oftentimes when they were near burning out would just simply catch on fire and became a bit of a fire hazard. And it stayed on for an impressive 13 and a half hours compared to these other ones that would burn out after 4 or 5. Edison also produced another innovation that we take for granted today: the use of a standard light bulb base that fit into any socket. Electricity was used for transportation as well. In 1879, the first electric railroad appeared in Berlin, Germany. And as early as 1880, electric streetcars began to replace horse-drawn carriages in major European cities. In 1901, an Italian, Guglielmo Marconi, sent radio waves across the Atlantic Ocean for the first time, thus creating the industry of radio and mass media. Now, among the most influential and far-reaching innovations of the Second Industrial Revolution was the internal combustion engine. It was first introduced in 1878. It was powered by gas and air, which made it impractical for widespread public use. However, once liquid fuels such as petroleum were introduced, the possibilities were improved. This engine led to the development of automobiles and airplanes, and without the internal combustion engine, none of the following inventions would have been possible. In a technological leap forward, German inventor Karl Benz patented the first automobile in 1886. And this was the first automobile designed to run on its own power. You may recognize his name, Benz, Mercedes-Benz. This model became the first automobile sold to the public in 1888. In that same year, Gottlieb Daimler invented a lightweight automobile engine, Chrysler Daimler. Another pioneer you probably are more familiar with, Henry Ford, made his mark by manufacturing his first automobile in 1896, and he perfected the assembly line method by making it efficient and cost-effective. His model made it possible to make the Model T affordable to the average working American and thus proliferate the number of cars on the roads. It was produced from 1908 to 1927, and this car was the first to be produced on an assembly line with interchangeable parts. Before mass production, automobiles were handcrafted by individuals, and this process was both time-consuming and expensive, but with Ford's process, the price of a Model T in 1920 was a mere $260. Still a lot of money, but pretty affordable by most family standards. And, someone asked him, well, what if I want the car in blue? And Henry Ford, one of my favorite quotes, is famous for saying, you can have the Model T in any color you want, as long as it's black. Advances in air technology during this time led to the Zeppelin in 1900. Pioneered by German Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, this airship was used to fly commercial customers and as a combat tool in World War I. Later in 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright made their famous first flight in a fixed-wing plane in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, even though they were from Ohio. The aircraft industry grew during World War I, and the very first passenger air service was established by 1919. Several important changes took place in the 19th century. First, around 1870, Germany became the new leader in European industry. They had taken the lead from Great Britain. And Germany far exceeded the production of any other European nation in chemicals and electrical equipment. The nation continued to expand its trade networks and soon enjoyed a flood of new plants and factories. And Great Britain tried to retake its position as industrial leader, but Germany would not give up its newly acquired titles so easily. And so the United States also enjoyed success during the Second Industrial Revolution. And in fact, industry had made the US the richest nation in the world at this time. Now, all these factors are going to play out in World War I. Germany and Britain aren't just fighting over, who should defend the Serbs and whether they should be free. They're fighting over, in France too, over economic dominance in this new era. The United States gets dragged into the war and becomes the savior of the world because we're the richest industrial nation at this time. So the Second Industrial Revolution caused growth in industry and transportation, which allowed increased trade between nations. And combined with a merchant marine capable of transporting goods by sea, a world economy began to form, one where countries were interdependent on other countries who were also interdependent on them. So what exactly is a world economy? A world economy or global economy is simply a description of the integration of trade in goods, services, and money worldwide. The spread of trade and investments abroad is linked with a process called imperialism. And imperialism has a very bad connotation, and in part it should, because of the effects of it. But we're going to talk about what it was. Between 1870 and 1900, European imperialism increased tremendously. Historians sometimes refer to this as new imperialism, which basically meant that Europeans were making a mad dash for pieces of Asia and Africa in order to claim natural resources that they could use in their factories. So why this sudden need for colonies? Well, colonization was basically the domination of Europeans over non-Europeans. And a major factor that influenced colonization was competition between different countries. In a quest for greater wealth, countries such as Britain sought colonies in Africa and Asia that would provide ports and perhaps even offer material resources. So the possible economic benefit of having colonies was a big motivation. And a lot of the colonies could offer material resources such as oil, tin, gold, diamonds. And by taking these areas, European countries cut out the middleman. They didn't need to trade because they now controlled the resources directly. So countries like Portugal, France, Britain, Belgium, Spain, and Germany had to set up colonies in Africa by 1914. And in Asia, the British, Dutch, Russians, French, and Portuguese had taken pieces as well. In addition, since competition between countries was so fierce, sometimes one country would set up colonies in an area just to keep another country out. For instance, France would scramble to set up colonies in an area just to make sure Britain, Russia, or Germany would not have access, even though those areas were in the Sahara and there was nothing but desert there. Once the colonization process started, all the major powers in Europe wanted a piece of the action. And if a country was not taking part in the process, they were viewed as weak. Of course, everyone did not agree about the benefits of having colonies. In 1852, Benjamin Disraeli, a very popular prime minister in Great Britain, said, "These wretched colonies will all be independent in a few years and are millstones around our necks." In fact, a common feeling was that colonies were entirely too much trouble to maintain and that the people would eventually rebel for their independence vis-a-vis the United States. So a well-known example of this was the Boer War in 1899. And if you've ever watched that Steven Spielberg movie, War Horse, the dad who, gives the kid who's before he goes to World War I a banner from his regiment, he participated in the Boer War. Opponents of imperialism were concerned about revolts, and these worries were realized when the Boer War broke out in 1899. Trouble began when the Dutch sold their Cape Town, South Africa colony to the English. The problem is the Dutch government sold it, but there's still a lot of Dutch people living there who aren't too happy about having to report to the British government. So originally a Dutch colony, this area was controlled by the Boers, who were descendants of Dutch colonists. And the British and the Boers struggled for power from the beginning. However, tensions reached a boiling point when Britain forced Cecil Rhodes to resign as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. Cecil Rhodes had been Prime Minister of the Cape Colony for decades. He'd been, in effect, the ruler. And he became very rich from it, by the way. If you've ever heard of a Rhodes Scholar, that's because he gave like multi-million dollars to establish that thing, and it's still around today. He was the richest man in the world at one point, having gotten, if you've ever heard of Boer's jewelry, he was part of that family. They got a lot of diamonds out of South Africa. So he had other ideas and attempted to overthrow the Boer government, and the war lasted until 1902 and resulted in massive casualties on both sides. It's estimated that 22,000 British soldiers were killed during the war. And despite being victorious, the majority of British citizens were not happy with the death toll or the huge cost of the war, because it was in Africa. What does it matter? Africa. Africa's this dark place with a bunch of savages. Why are we even there? Of course, wealth was not the only motivation for establishing colonies. During this time, the prevailing attitude of many Europeans was that they were more advanced than people who lived in other areas of the world. And rather than trying to understand other cultures, they believed that they were barbarians or uncivilized. And this way of thinking led to the attempt to change these cultures. And one way to do this, to civilize these cultures, was to introduce Christianity into these areas. And a lot of Catholic and Protestant missionaries traveled to colonies in Asia and Africa and attempted to convert people to Christianity. And to these people, it was their moral obligation to convert not just Europeans in order to save their souls. Now, they looked at this as a civilizing effort. We're going to bring modern technology, modern civilization, Christianity to these people. It's our duty as more civilized, more Christian people. As a matter of fact, they referred to it as the white man's burden. It was the white man's burden to go out and civilize these poor, unfortunate people. Now, you can kind of tell by the framework, white man's burden, poor, unfortunate people, that we're setting up kind of a subhuman category and a racist category here. So the definition of politics, when we talk about the politics of this time, and we'll talk about the general definition of politics, is really not that simple. According to Webster's dictionary, politics involves influencing the policies of a government. Another piece of that puzzle is the process of gaining power and then somehow keeping it. So as we'll see, these problems are far from new to history. The governments of France, England, the German Republic all faced political problems that divided their states. And many of you have heard the advice, don't talk about religion or politics. But why? Well, because people are usually very passionate and opinionated about these subjects, and avoiding them is a good way to avoid an argument. In the next few sections, we'll talk about why politics was such a touchy subject in 19th century Europe. And we'll start with the Third French Republic. The First French Republic, remember, came after the French Revolution. The Second French Republic came after the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. The Third French Republic comes after the fall of his nephew, who had taken over, if you recall, Louis Napoleon III. So the Third French Republic began in 1875, and it lasted 65 years. So when Otto von Bismarck and the Prussian army defeated France in 1870, the Second Empire of Louis Napoleon was over. And Bismarck forced the French to elect government representatives by voting. And during this time, two parties dominated the government: the monarchists, who advocated a return to the monarchy, and the Republicans, who wanted a government based on a constitution and elections. The men of France, only men were able to vote, voted the monarchist party into a majority of the seats in the National Assembly. But having lost most of their political power, the radical Republicans formed the Commune, a separate government that operated out of Paris. Seeing this, the National Assembly confronted the Commune with outright violence, and naturally the French public chose sides in this conflict and became somewhat of a civil war. For the most part, workers of both genders sided with the Commune, while National Assembly support mostly came from the upper classes. Interestingly, women played a large part in this conflict. For instance, they took on roles such as feeding and providing medical care to soldiers, performing scouting duties, and even organizing their own combat brigades. They call them the Amazon Brigades. In the end, the National Assembly soldiers succeeded in suppressing the Commune, and historians estimate that about 20,000 Commune defenders were killed. And this conflict caused lasting political effects in France by creating an emotional division between classes. And despite the desire of many monarchists to return to a monarchy, they could not agree on who should be king. And because of this, in 1875, they established this constitution that set up a Republican government and began what we call the Third Republic. The Republicans gained more political power in the elections of 1876 and 1877. In 1879, the powers of the Chamber of Deputies were defined more clearly. The Chamber of Deputies is a branch of this republic. During the Third French Republic, the Chamber of Deputies was the legislative branch of the National Assembly. And although the Third Republic continued to gain public support, several groups such as the Catholic clergy, the monarchists, and the aristocracy still remained opposed to them. So that's where I'm going to leave you today in the interest of time. Do you guys have any questions for me about any of this?
There are two things. One was about the last set of slides we had. You did about Japan.
Uh-huh.
I just had thought, so when I think it's like Peter, the general who took his boats and like in the...
Oh, Matthew Perry.
And put his boats right outside Japan.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that's the first time then they've had ever seen like metal ships, because they had still wooden ships at the time.
Yes. And Commodore Perry's fleet was steam powered, but I wouldn't say they were totally metal. The metal ships, I mean, if you're thinking about like the American Civil War, what were the iron-sided ships, those were more coastal ships. They really couldn't cross the ocean. So we had steam-powered ships, but they weren't totally fully metal. But they were impressed with the lot of black smoke that was coming out of them. There's reports of Japanese saying there were sea dragons off their coast.
And the other question I kind of had was, how was it then that Germany, I guess, was able to become the industrial superpower over the British?
Because you got to remember, we talked about the unification of Germany last week.
Yeah.
Prior to that, Germany was a bunch of little countries with divided resources. It's like, if you want to play the Chicago Bears, it's going to be very hard to do it by yourself. But if you can get 20, 30 other guys to come together, you might be able to overpower the Bears, right?
They had more resources than
the
British
and they were more organized because they were one country now instead of a bunch of competing little countries.
And like the British were stuck with their little island of resources.
Exactly.
Okay.
Good questions. Leonie, did you have any questions?
Not really.
Okay. All right. Well, then we'll continue our discussion about the 19th century tomorrow. At the end of the 19th century particularly, and then eventually we'll wrap up, I believe, this week, and I'll give you guys your test to do at home should you choose to do it. And then I think that the end of next week we're going to start talking about World War I and moving into the world wars. And looking at the calendar, I think that's the best I'm going to be able to do is get to the end of World War II before the class is over. So we're looking at the end here. All right, guys, have a good day. It looks like it's going to be a real nice one, so go out and enjoy it. Hopefully, I'll see you tomorrow.
See you, bye.